And the fifth speaker is from Korea, and Dr. Cho. Please start your lecture.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. I'm Dr. Choi from Seoul, Korea. Today I would like to talk about back to the eyes and optical differentiation of a newer IOLs. And same as Korea, more and more EDoF IOLs are available in the market and getting more popular. Today I will talk about two EDoF lenses, VVT from Alcon and PRC lens techniques. And briefly talking about the Odyssey lens recently launched in Korea. This slide is from a company, Alcon VVT has their own non-diffractive type of technology to make a depth of focus in the central part here. When you take an electron microscope, we can see the structure here. And what about the PRC lenses? It also has the non-diffractive type and wavefront technology to increase the depth of focus. And similarly, we can observe some slight elevation in central part. And today I will talk about the clinical outcomes of a VVT and a PRC lens briefly, and our optic laboratory background will be followed. And these are our previous publications about in multifocal IOL, and we will compare with the VVT lens and the PRC lens together. And the advantage of EDoF lenses is superior in the focus curve, as we know well. And also the EDoF lens show the better tolerance to residual refractive error. And if we look at briefly outcomes of VVT and PRC lens here, distant, intermediate, near visual acuity was similar or better than the previous type of symphony lenses. And if you look at all together with our previous same settings studies, and the VVT and PRC also showing the quite comparable or decent intermediate vision. And these are the focus curve altogether. And as we know, and this near part were better with the bilateral trifocal synergy or panoptics lenses. And this area from distant to intermediate area always better with the mix and match with the EDoF lenses. What about the VVT and PRC? The most striking feature of the PRC lens is very broad landing zone here in the distant visual acuity from the plus area to distant part. And the VVT is providing us the very continuous curve from the distant to intermediate part. This option is better than any other studied lenses we have done before. And let's look at the optical bench test outcomes. We measure these settings and we tested two different cornea spherical aberration, 0 and positive 0.28. And we measured the three different types of aperture. And previously we published about it is very important to understand the pupil size and the spherical aberration of the IOL itself, because they're similar to Symphony and the LARA lens showed totally different outcomes in the large pupil size, depending on the spherical aberration of lens itself. Because Symphony lenses has a negative spherical aberration, so in the larger pupil, it showed better outcomes than the LARA lenses. Every hour patient have a different pupil size. This is photos after 1 month. So it is very important to understand and recognize the pupil size preoperatively, because every human optics has their own optical aberration. So with a more enlarged pupil, they will suffer from the disrupted PSF images. And recently we developed a mathematical calculation software which convert MTF curve into MTF diagram to help the understanding of my patient. So this central part represents the peak in the MTF curve distant area and intermediate ring and the near ring. So these diameters are correlated with the added power from the distant visual acuity, and the brightness scale is correlated with the height of an MTF chart. If we convert these three different types of trifocal lenses here, and we can see the totally different shape of an MTF diagram. And if you look at these two lenses, we can expect a better intermediate near function with this lens. The patient can easily understand these diagrams with some explanation. And also this LISA 3 lens is showing the brighter and wider central part, so it will give us the more forgiving outcomes in the distant vision. And this is monofocal IOL, and the eye-enhanced lenses are spreading a little bit more. And what about the VVT lenses? It shows a very bright spot in the central part, correlating with this part, and continuous intermediate part reaching out to the 2 diopter added power here. And 2 millimeter outcomes show differently. Very broad and higher peak, and especially in the intermediate part, and the MTF diagram is showing the brighter and the broader images. And 4 millimeter outcomes, a larger pupil, will show the much higher peak in the distant area and a decreased intermediate part, but distant energy was preserved. And what about the POC lenses? It's quite a similar shape in the 3 millimeter standard pupil size. And sometimes it shows a very nice peak in the distant, but the intermediate part was a little bit decreased compared to the VVT lenses. And 2 millimeter outcomes will enhance their function in the distant broad landing zone here, as we have seen it before in clinical outcomes. So intermediate part was a little bit smoothly decreased and reaching out to the 1.5 diopter. And most striking feature from the POC lenses and larger pupil size, here we can see very hot spots small in the central part, and the MTF curve is showing only the 1 peak. It's quite similar with the monofocal lenses. That is the most interesting part of the POC lenses. If we compare both lenses together, we can see much broader and functional intermediate vision could be preserved from the VVT lenses, as we can see easily from the diagram here. But in the larger pupil size, POC will provide a very clear distant vision, but we cannot expect a better intermediate or near function from the POC lenses. So we can say a more pupil-dependent characteristic was observed from the POC lenses. It means sometimes it's good, but when we meet the larger pupil with the POC lenses, we cannot expect the intermediate near function. In reverse, if the patient has a too small pupil size, if the patient with the POC lens can complain about the disturbed distant vision. So it is very important to recognize the pupil size to predict the best outcomes. And the positive spherical aberration affect a little bit to the POC lens. It enhances more because the Technis family has the negative spherical aberration. And 2 millimeter will enhance a little bit, and 4 millimeter will show a more higher peak. It's totally similar with the monofocal IOL. And sometimes we can see this kind of a patient in the post-op wavefront analysis. We can see very hot spot in central part after the POC implantation because it has the very narrow energy in the central part. So if there is a zero angle kappa and a small pupil, I think he can suffer from disturbed distant vision, but he can see very well intermediate and near part, depending on the pupil size. BBT also showed a similar effect, but the color is very weakened compared to the POC lenses. And this is a monofocal IOL of Technis family, and not that big change depending on pupil size, but eye-enhanced lens is showing the right shift with a small pupil to increase the depth of focus. That's a unique shape of the eye-enhanced lenses. If we compare with the POC lens altogether, these all are the Technis family, but they are showing a totally different shape of the MTF curve. And briefly, I bring on one slide, all these lenses. We just tested lenses. This is quite interesting lens I have ever tested. Because as we can see here, there is no change in the distant peak. So it is providing a consistent distant vision and also the intermediate and the near part. So it started from the 1 diopter to reaching out to the 3.5 near function. So we can expect it consistent distant vision and distant intermediate and the near function. Because previously I showed you before, Technis previous trifocal lens synergy shows a totally different MTF curve. Even if it looks roughly similar in the microscope, and they are having a totally different optic characteristics. And this part is quite similar with the panoptics optics and this part is very unique, independent of the pupil size. In summary, I cannot definitely say that the newer the better, but absolutely there was an advancement in the quality of vision and decreasing dysphotopsia. So it is very important to understand the characteristics of IOLs to individualize your patient. Thank you for your attention.